So good afternoon, folks. My name is Dr. Danielle Pontes Morgan, and I am an associate professor in the Department of English, and I'm also the director for the Center for the Arts and Humanities. Let me give you a brief rundown of what the Center for the Arts and Humanities is. The Center for the Arts and Humanities at Santa Clara University fosters interdisciplinary collaboration in research, creative activity, and outreach. One of our main goals is that we build and support partnerships, projects, and programming like this on campus that works to bring together faculty, students, staff, visiting artists, and scholars and community to use the arts and the humanities as building blocks for a better future and a more just world. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event, Black Moon, a Phenomenology of the Negro Witch, a talk by Dr. Nicholas Whittaker, which is our spring headline event, organized by Dr. Madeline Ahmed Cronin. So Dr. Madeline Ahmed Cronin is a teaching professor in philosophy, specializing in political philosophy and feminist theory here at Santa Clara University. Her research focuses on the politics of taste, which has led to her current work on the conceptual art and philosophy of an old favorite of mine, Adrian Piper, and to the wonderful scholarship and writing of a new favorite of mine, Nicholas Whittaker. So I will turn things over to Madeline and let her take it away.
Yeah, no, it's my, yes, please. It's my honor to introduce you, Dr. Nicholas Whittaker. I'm really grateful you're coming today, and if you're interested to learn more, as I suspect you will after this, I highly recommend, especially, lots of your work, both academic and for public audiences, but for instance, like your series at The Point on Black horror, I really recommend. Dr. Nicholas Whittaker is an assistant professor of philosophy at Wesleyan University, and you've published a range of academic work, including in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, and have also written about movies, books, blackness, and love for publications including New York Times and the LA Review of Books, and as I mentioned, The Point. And you are currently working on a book on Black horror cinema, of which this talk is a part. So I hope you will all join me in welcoming Nicholas Whittaker.
So wonderful to be here. Thank you, everyone. Did I get the lights? Thank you. So I'm just going to open and close with a bit from the film, the beginning and the end. I'll fill in the middle bits, as it were. And I'll just flag, so there shouldn't be anything too disruptive in anything that we're actually going to see. We will be discussing sexual assault and long history of American colonialism, so unpleasant topics for sure, but we'll do our best. You know, Miriam Charles does a very good job. Yeah, well, thank you. Sorry. Miriam Charles does a very good job of taking care of her audience throughout the film, and I'm going to try to do the same. So thank you for bearing with me on that. Okay, relax for the next 4 minutes. Oops. Now relax for the next 4 minutes.
Ce qu'on propose, une annonce des choses à venir. Installer la possibilité d'un voyage fluide dans le temps et dans l'espace. Mon histoire est à la fois tragique et remplie d'espoir. L'espoir fait vivre. Ça semblait à Kyle. Ça semblait à Kyle. Ça semblait à Kyle. Non, c'est ça. 10 ans passés.
It is October 2023. Samhain approaches. I am in New York City. I am in a small, airy theater in East Chinatown. I have been there all day. I am seeking, as I so often am, in small theaters at strange hours. Do not ask me what I am seeking. That question must be, as it were, unasked. I have not found it, but I have been found. That is what it feels like as Cette Maison begins. A black skin, scarred by flecks of white, an empty frame, 16 millimeters of emptiness dispersed by light across 50 feet of emptiness. That emptiness has form. It has a shape, gigantic and sub-oceanic, luxuriant and tormented. I mean, I hear music. Not quite a chord, not quite noise. Noise searching for harmony, gliding up and down the vibratory scale in search of some affinity, some intimacy, some friendship. Expanding, contracting sine waves in the sand. They lap the shore of something. Some stone, some stubborn surface that will not be submerged, will not disappear and dissipate. We have to return, we are told. Together. We have to go home now. Water smolders and seethes silently under the surface of itself. We have to go to Haiti. Do you hear something? For 73 minutes, something happens. I listen to a film. The film tells me that somewhere there is a city called Bridgeport, Connecticut. There is a house there. In that house, a young human being was found. After 14 years of breathing, that body had stopped breathing. There was a noose around its neck, but that is not why the body stopped breathing. That is not where the purple bruises come from. They come from human hands, which wrapped around his throat until this body stopped breathing, until this body was hung from a rope as though it had hung itself there. 7 months later, I move into a house 42 miles north of Bridgeport, Connecticut. I begin teaching at Wesleyan University. I teach young human beings about the horrible things we do to each other. I watch movies about these things obsessively. I call them black horror movies. I write the first draft of a book about these movies. I think about Cette Maison. I listen to it again and again. The film names her Tara. In reality, her name is Tessa. She died 42 miles south of where I now live. She died 18 years ago. Tessa was born in Stamford, Connecticut. Her family entered the United States from Canada. Before that, her family entered Canada from Haiti. Tessa's cousin, Miriam, remained in Canada when Tessa left, or when Tessa's family left. Miriam made short films for years, until one day she made a film that was 73 minutes long. she made Cette Maison, to remember the life and death of Tessa, the social death of Haiti. So Charles calls Cette Maison a documentary. It is, as you might have been able to tell, entirely illegible as such. No talking head interviews. What facts are offered are hazy and obscured by fictional embellishment. Names are changed when individuals are identified at all. Memories and speculation alike are portrayed by actors, and no real plot surfaces. Things happen, albeit buried within an avalanche of Charles's trademark landscape shots, of which the first 4 minutes of the film was entirely composed, but do not hang into a single story. It is simpler to say this. Cette Maison simply does not seem to document anything. It does not record, as it were, anything real. And yet, Charles insists, and here's a direct quote. Sometimes the film is classified as fiction, and I think, no, it's documentary. I did the research. It is very interesting to deconstruct the way we see documentary. Everything is supposed to be so formulaic, so conventional. When I pitched the film as a documentary, it was difficult to get it funded because they would tell me, this is not the way you document reality. I was proposing, what we proposed, that there could be a different way to comment on and experience reality. What precisely is Charles's different way to comment on and experience reality? I am not merely curious, I think I have been after the same thing for quite some time. After all, I have relatively recently been inducted into the ranks of the University Academy. Woohoo. In doing so, I have committed myself, haven't I, to documenting reality. What else could be the task of the academic, the scholar, the student of reality? Is our task not to declare, to mark and disseminate the truth of reality? I, like Charles, am not satisfied by this documentarian mandate. And yet our rejection of, in the broadest sense of the words, realism for surrealism is not itself satisfying to many. This is due to a general documentarian mandate on culture or artistic production, perhaps, but Charles and I are, I suspect, coming up against a particular form of that general mandate. For we are not simply concerned with reality broadly defined. We are concerned with, we are trying to care for and take care of, to care about, a particular event, a particular crisis, the murder of Tessa. And we are concerned with the general pattern within which that event occurs, the long event of the Haitian diaspora, which is to say, black suffering and social death. And we are concerned with an organizing structure or atmosphere within which that pattern takes form, white supremacist empire. This thrice-faced phenomenon, this dark and terrible secret, this dissident drone piercing through Cette Maison, this is reality, as we see it. And it is a reality that, in different forms across centuries, the internally antagonistic coalition of scholars, artists, and activists performing the study of race has striven to document. Not out of intellectual curiosity, but political pragmatism and affective need. A pragmatism and a desire that haunt both myself and Charles. And yet, we refuse to take up the project that pragmatism and that desire seem to demand. I want us to consider this idiosyncrasy against another oddity of the film. For Charles does not build Cette Maison, her movie, her string of moving pictures, out of images. Here's another direct quote. For all of my films, I usually start from sound and music. Usually what I do is I record a lot of soundscapes and music. And when I start a project, I record voice-over narration, if there's narration, because for me, narration has a musical sense to it. Then I edit everything, and afterwards place the image on top of the sound. Why, you might ask? Here, again, is Charles herself. Sound allows us more freedom in telling stories. In images, we automatically look for sense or purpose. We try to make connections with images. With sound, there's a little bit of room. It's okay to hear it not knowing exactly where you are or what's happening. Your brain is more open that way. There's an extended break, so this seems like a bit of a tangent, but it's really not. In reality, so many things are unexplained. There are so many things that I don't understand. So for me, as a creator, it is very hard for me to create linear stories. So Charles's idiosyncratic dependence on sound suggests the concerns that led her to a certain idiosyncratic resistance to documenting reality in the conventional fashion. A desire for mystery. A sensitivity to aesthetic experiences of openness and indeterminacy. A desire for a cinema capable of documenting a reality in excess of narrative sense or purpose. We might say, I am after a philosophical practice or mode of theory capable of the same. What we are after is an account of reality, specifically of the reality of Black suffering, that escapes what we might call, following theorists as mysterious to each other as Martin Heidegger and C.T. Nguyen, as an epistemology of clarity. By clarity, I mean the moment at which we feel as though we understand something, by which I mean we feel as though we have reached a satisfactory account of it. Clarity is not just a moment of achievement. It is a moment of elation and satisfaction at the now clear picture we have of reality, on the one hand, and a related sense of closure. The investigations that took us here are now concluded, and we feel pleased, perhaps even relieved, at having reached this point. Clarity is not an ahistorical phenomenon. No feeling or thought is. This sense that, to quote Heidegger, the world stands firm as guaranteed, requires the development of taxonomical schemas that, again quote, orders reality into place. Categories and proper names, quote unquote, sunder and compartmentalize the world into isolated, ordered atoms who possess identifying ontological characteristics and causal relations with each other. These schemas, or Heidegger's word, Grundrisse, there's going to be a lot of German from someone who doesn't speak German, so prepare yourself for the pronunciations now. These schemas, or Grundrisse, first sketch, ground plan, design, all good translations, allow us to document by modeling reality. These schemas are not theoretical or abstract. They can be seen in the combination of geopolitical, materialist, and epistemological transfigurations that, over the past 4 or 5 centuries, have led social institutions to prioritize the accumulation of, these are the words of the great sociologist and political theorist James Scott, to prioritize the accumulation of standardized, quantified information. This information aims to render reality, again a quote, more legible, hence more manipulable from above and from the center. End quote. To render reality legible, meaning mappable through standardized, quantified data systems to facilitate its terraformation. We are shaped by these epistemological and existential structures to value and pursue clarity. The feeling of certainty, of satisfactory completeness, comprehension, serves as the goal and criteria for success of epistemic inquiry across the sciences, the humanities, and the arts. The study of race has been structured by this goal and criteria since its inception. Ought we be satisfied with this? Charles is not. I am not. I found an alternative in a dark room days before Samhain. Across 73 minutes, reality was not clarified but made murky, obscure, like static fuzz. This was not my first descent. I have performed this ritual of obfuscation many times, every time I step in front of the things we call black horror movies. These movies, I think, are best understood not as windows into a black reality, but as ritual inhabitations of a black situation, a black atmosphere, a black mood. This inhabitation is performed precisely at the collapse of comprehension, of clarity. It is a kind of black witchcraft. From 1914 to 1934, the U.S. State Department was the primary governmental authority in Haiti. Their occupation was ordered by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. It was primarily urged by the National City Bank of New York. It was enforced by martial law. History repeats itself. I just cannot not say, right? And the central military force on the island combined the U.S. Marines and the local Garde à Vue, which was created and controlled by the Marines. Haiti's banks, national treasury, and other economic and administrative institutions also came under direct control of the U.S. government. Among other things, this meant that 40% of Haiti's national income, the income, by the way, of a country we're repeatedly told is a shithole, 40% of Haiti's national income was forcibly directed to paying off debts Haiti had incurred with the U.S. and France by its slave revolution and Declaration of Independence. Besides institutional takeover, the occupation deployed various other power-stabilizing tactics. These included mass genocides on civilian villages, including possibly, this is a direct quote from a really great work on the history of voodoo, which I'll get to in a second. The first raids ever carried out by air on civilian populations. Numerous villages were bombed and shot by American fighter pilots. A corvée system of forced labor that was, in essence, slavery. Jim Crow codes. The replacement of various Haitian elites and officials with the mixed-race bourgeoisie loyalists. And public executions and torture, sans trial, of course. Another tactic must be considered. Notice that the development of American silent and early sound cinema, which culminates in the Golden Age initiated in 1931, coincides exactly with the occupation of Haiti. In the years prior to that watershed, many popular books on Haiti were published in the United States. Most focused specifically on voodoo, or Vodun, a set of ritual practices, religious principles, and cosmological views, creolizing African and Euro-Christian practices, at many times the most popular religion, a vastly insufficient word, in Haiti and across its extensive diaspora. Books with the names like The Magic Island, The White King of La Gonave, Cannibal Cousins, and the like, told sensational tales of unholy, cruel, violent ceremonies practiced by paint-daubed Negroes deep in the jungle. These travelogues led to a voodoo craze, which culminated in a 10-year cycle of voodoo-themed horror movies, spanning from 1932's White Zombie, starring Bela Lugosi, the titular Dracula, as a white witch doctor, to 1943's I Walked with a Zombie. And this is like, I still pinch myself to see if this is actually true what I'm about to say, but I've poured through as many film archives as I can, and I really think this is true. In fact, until 1957, the only American horror films containing witches were voodoo films. The only. White witches appear exclusively in fantasies, children's cartoons, and romantic comedies without exception. For the first 60 years, there's already witch movies in Hollywood by the late 1890s. For the first 40 years of American cinema, the horrific witch was definitionally a Negro. This artistic controlling image was accompanied by massive, violent, anti-superstition campaigns across Haiti and the southern U.S., and a cultural demonization of Vodun that continues to this day. God forbid you tell someone you practice Vodun in 2026. Frantz Fanon suggests that this should not surprise us. For, and this is a direct quote from Black Skin, White Masks, in Europe, the black man, whether physically or symbolically, represents the dark side of the personality. Darkness, obscurity, shadows, gloom, night, the labyrinth of the underworld, the murky depths, blackening someone's reputation. Such associations inevitably, Fanon suggests, crystallize into a particular narrative account of black life and culture. I'll quote again. I am walking on hot coals. Sheets of water threaten my soul on fire. These rites make me think twice. Black magic, orgies, Sabbaths, pagan ceremonies, gris-gris. From every direction, I am assailed by the obscenity of the dances and the propositions. The ground, up till now a bridled steed, begins to rock with laughter. Are these nymphomaniacs virgins? Black magic, primitive mentality, animism, and animal eroticism. All this surges towards me. All this typifies people who have not kept pace with the evolution of humanity. Or, if you prefer, they constitute third-rate humanity. Fanon argues that the witch is one of two basic forms the Negro takes in Euro-American culture. The other is the hyperbiological body, or the ape. So the book that this talk is based on, this is the final chapter of the book. My book explores the foundational presence of these two figures, the Negro ape and the Negro witch, in American horror films specifically. So the chapter immediately prior to this one has worked out this image of the Negro ape. These two images are, in fact, as the Fanon quotes already were sort of insinuating, I think, profoundly related. We can trace the genealogy of the Negro witch archetype back to the early European encounters with the sub-Saharan, tribal West Africa encounters, that is, beyond Muslim and Christian Saharan and North African empires. Traveler accounts report strange humanoid animals, apes without tails, as one Portuguese sailor put it, engaged in activities that looked, for all the world, like ritual worship of a ceremonial object. Such animals, of course, could not have the capacity for rational thought required for genuine spirituality. They lacked access to the pure rational idea of the good, of the divine, towards which all spiritual practice must, according to the European worldview, bend. That's the difference, these people look right, between these objects and, say, the Eucharist. One is just a symbol of this rational idea, the other is this mistaken identity. Right? As such, what appeared to be ceremony, to be free, a gentle human action, was merely material cause and effect. Just as Descartes, torturing cats, heard their screams not as the expression of a genuine experience of pain, but as mere material cause and effect, whatever that means, as mere affectable externality. The result of these early encounters with these sub-Saharan Africans was what I call in the book an uncanny experience. A binary conceptual structure is erected. Human beings with the capacity for self-determination, unbound from biophysical law, and thus with the capacity for culture, on the one hand, and non-human animals who lack this capacity, and thus culture itself. Yet, now, a liminal creature is encountered, one that fits both, and thus neither, of these exclusively disjuncted categories. The result is a genuinely incomprehensible or unclarifiable entity, inasmuch as comprehension entails the placement of an entity into a stable, final category. This is, I argue, the crisis of race, the encounter with genuine uncanniness or categorical instability/crisis within the history of Europe. This is also the central crisis of the horror genre, and those are not coincidences. Neither is there historical contemporaneity. Both the genre of horror and the genre of race comes to existence in 1740 to 1760. It's far too constrained, but it's really, there's this real historical precision to this convergence. Zombies, for instance, are liminal living corpses. They are both and therefore neither nor, living and dead. The Black Witch, too, is in a sense living and dead. A human with the capacity for robust experience and culture, and an animal with only dead space where human capacity should be. This is, I suspect, the source of Baudin's terror, its uncanniness. And this explains the central role of the horror genre in the production of anti-Black controlling images and narratives in the early 20th century, and all racial controlling images. I'm really obsessed with doing these sort of archival counting projects, and you can actually really count on hands and toes the amounts of horror monsters in the 1930s that are not explicitly connected to some race, right? Whether that's the Russians, the Slavs, right, et cetera, right? The Appalachians. Horror, I argue, has a special historical relationship with race, itself best understood as the production of inhuman monsters for thought and experience. We must take seriously the substantial role horror texts about Baudin played in the American experience of both Haiti and the witch archetype. Golden Age Baudin horror, The Magic Island, and White Zombie strove to document, as it were, the true, not merely fictional, monstrosity of the Negro. But that discourse is not the only attempt to clarify the phenomenon of the Black Witch. The history of the concept of race is the history of attempts to clarify these uncanny bodies, to identify them as either simply animal or simply human. Similarly, medical, religious, and psychological experts have historically endeavored to clarify the practical psychology, naturally occurring toxins, and secret medicines that explain the apparent magic of Vodun. After all, Zora Neale Hurston puts it best in her fantastic book on Jamaican and Haitian Vodun. Here in the shadow of the Empire State Building, death and life are final. It is such a positive end that we use it as a measure of nothingness and eternity. We have the quick and the dead. Hurston is incredible. No third possibility, no living death or undead life can fit within these taxonomical schemas. The zombies that dot Hades' fields and rustle, forgotten in its forests, must be interpreted as merely humans on a drug-induced fugue state. But Hurston is not so easily convinced. She goes on. What is the whole truth, and nothing else but the truth, about zombies? I do not know. But I know that I saw the broken remnant, relic, or refuse of Felicia Felix Mentor in a hospital yard. We have the quick and the dead. But in Haiti, there is the quick, the dead, and then there are zombies. I know that there are zombies in Haiti. People have been called back from the dead. One might, understandably, accuse Hurston of participating in the very same dehumanizing, monsterizing discourse found in the Magic Island in White Zombie. She, that is, renders blackness and Vodun uncanny, rather than clarify them. And given the role of black uncanniness and the anti-black production of race, Hurston seems to here reproduce the very conditions of that reproduction. And yet, we must immediately notice the parallel between Hurston and Charles here. The latter, after all, in interviews, describes Cette Maison as haunted. Let us take that seriously. Cette Maison is a strange, idiosyncratic exemplar of the black horror genre. This genre exploded into the mainstream with Peele's Get Out and Us, yes. It's impossible for me to mention this without people mentioning Jordan Peele, but stretches back to the hood horror films of the 90s and 2000s. Tales from the Hood is the obvious best of the the blaxploitation horror classics of the 70s, Blackula, Blackula Strikes Again, Blackenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Black, I could go on, Voodoo and Negro 8 films in the 30s and 40s, and scared spook films in the 1910s. In these films, blackness, a black world, and an anti-black world are depicted through the emotions and moods of horror. Feelings structured fundamentally, I argue here and elsewhere, by the experience of uncanniness, of categorical crisis and subsequent global incomprehensibility. This is a profoundly paradoxical experience of unfamiliar familiarity that, just to give us some signposts, that you could compare to Heideggerian angst, Stanley Cavell's theory of alienation, and Sartrean and Beauvoirian nausea. It's not quite those, but that's just a good landmark. In these films, all conceptual categorization feels unsatisfactory. The world feels unclarifiable, yet insistently present in its familiar form, as though the world revealed itself to be its own doppelganger. Black horror film suggests that this is what living in an anti-black world should feel like, not does, I think, really importantly. Cette Maison does not simply depict or document the colonial reality, the reality of black proximity to death, because it renders that reality uncanny. An atmosphere of undecidability, of illegibility, of inarticulable strangeness suffuses every frame of this film, every moment of its thundering, doom-laden soundtrack. The film possesses its own zombie. Sorry. Thank you. The film possesses its own zombie, Terra, or its own zombie, its own living corpse, Terra, a Brechtian, as in Bertolt Brecht, explicitly self-conscious performance of a non-existent adult Tessa by actor Shelby Jean-Baptiste. Tara haunts a version of Tessa's mother, embodied by actor Florence Blaine Mbaye. The film is a horror film in which Jean-Baptiste and Mbaye are possessed by Tara and her mother. Tara and her mother are Loa now. They ride the horse like we ride the rhythm. Erzuli Dantor and her baby are out hungry. In Cette Maison, life and death are blurred into liminal sludge. The result is an unclarifiable, ambiguous living death. An event, Tessa's death, thus black social death, thus white supremacist empire, is not documented in the sense of captured, clarified, and comprehended. It is made uncanny by the blurring of the operative concepts that allow us to make sense and moral meaning out of that event. The concepts, I mean, of life and death. But this is not fiction. Charles insists that Cette Maison is real. She did the research. We make sense of this paradox when we recall that, for Charles, reality, not just art, not just horror art, is profoundly incomprehensible. As she says, so many things aren't explained. There are zombies in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in a house on a suburban street, although Charles can't recognize it anymore. Something spooky happened here in Cette Maison. This old, dark house, this suburban cookie cutter, that blood-soaked prison cell in Port-au-Prince, those strange rocking holes, this fucked up world. Charles and Hurston may indeed share a proclivity towards an uncanny articulation of anti-blackness. But why? Why do I insist on sharing it? What is the point of an art or a theory practice actively resistant to the pursuit of clarity? Of a practice willing to use the programs of horror, of Brechtian alienation, of surrealist ethnography, of anti-scholastic mysticism, to obfuscate one's own documentation of blackness? In his brilliant study of Caribbean philosophy, a tradition to which I suppose I, like Charles, belong, Paget Henry suggests that we understand that philosophy as fundamentally structured by its origins. Not just in the literal monastic scholastic tradition of the European University Academy, but in the ritual-structured, practice-based metaphysical systems now called, again, far too small a word, folk religion, which of course includes Bodin itself. Such systems are functionally organized, Henry argues, for practices of what he calls ego work. Ego work practices do not aim at comprehension. Their goal and criteria of success is not clarification of one's existence or the nature of reality. Rather, such practices aim to get the agent into a relationship of acceptance of and surrender to the profound atmosphere of an unintelligibility within which one begins the practice. They are, as it were, rehearsals of submission to the unclarifiable and to unclarifiability itself. On this model, Bodin's practices of possession by Loa, of riding the horse, must be appreciated as fundamentally uncanny within, not merely without, the practice, or what Phenomenology will call the Weltanschauung, or worldview of the practice. On the practice's metaphysical system, a human being is not an isolated atom in space-time. That's just not what we are. Rather, such a being is a shifting, blurry expression of unclarifiable, extra-subjective forces. You can call them Loa, you can also call them quanta, right? A momentary shape that a subterranean existence can take. This factical existence is itself not conceptually bounded. Riding the horse rituals thus serve to fracture one's phenomenology of the world. That's their aim, rather than to reconstitute it. The aim is to make the world and oneself unclarifiable so that the boundary between oneself and the world becomes illusory, and that which seems otherwise external can be felt and seen to manifest within oneself. One's existence survives its dissolution. The result is a way of experiencing not only oneself, but life and death writ large as uncanny paradoxes that outstrip intelligibility. I always, to my students, I just give them the four-sided triangle as like a prime example of what I'm talking about, right? That is like a paradox that remains for thought in some way. Its paradoxical structure doesn't disappear it, right? And I'm sort of suggesting that's a way in which we can start to think about something like race. I have just described the horror genre. There's a horror movie from the 70s called The Four-Sided Triangle. Horror films force us into a particular mood, a particular experience of reality as uncanny and unintelligible. They are, as it were, ritual inhabitations of an uncanny world. In these worlds, our human-centric existential projects lack significance because the concepts by which we clarified their meaning have become unsatisfactory. These rituals of inhabitation are typically structured by melancholy. Yeah, I'm meaning this in the Freudian sense. Talk more about that. By an obsessive lingering over the feeling of loss created by the devastation of sense or purpose. In my book, I follow, in the chapter immediately prior to this one, I follow theorists like Jose Esteban Munoz in holding faith in the political and existential significance of melancholy. And I could make sense of Cette Maison in this way. I could say, that Charles has made a film obsessed with the loss of Tessa and of black safety and joy in the wake of European empire. But, so this is within the last 5 minutes of the film, this image, and just, I don't think that's all that Cette Maison is after. And I think that's very clearly not all that this film is after. I do not think that melancholy captures the extent of the significance of the uncanny ritual of the black horror film. After all, if these films are genuinely uncanny, we must reapproach all conceptual distinctions, even those of good or bad, valuable or empty, beautiful and ugly. Melancholy is, as it were, too simple a description for the feeling such approach would evoke. You can also say this: a melancholic account of black horror does not listen, and listen hard, when Charles says that she did not make a film about Tessa's death, but about her life. She says this explicitly in an interview. And what does it mean to take that seriously? As Henry describes processes of ego work, one finds both one's own sorrow and one's own joy through such a process. One regains what Heidegger might call a sense of nearness to one's own life, precisely by becoming unable to see it simply as one's own, or as life. A random thought that just popped into my head. I've never really realized until I say that, for the second time I've given this talk, how profoundly influenced by care ethics this particular sort of thought is, in a way that I am curious to play out, but anyways. The aim of these practices, in other words, is a heightened sense of inhabitance in reality, in the world. This suggestion is one echoed in Chinese Taoism, French existentialism, contemporary neuroscience, and far, far beyond. Conceptual categorization and the clarity it offers has a cost. That cost is a profound sense, I here follow Stanley Cavell as well as Heidegger, of distance from that which has been clarified. A distance I want to understand as aesthetic in a really robust, embodied sense. We feel in our affects and in our literal perceptual experience, removed from or merely alongside the world we are a part of. A world that has been occulted by the perfect maps, a la Borges and Baudrillard, right, that are our taxonomical schemas. To be made near, or in Cavell's lovely words, intimate with the world, would therefore require surrendering the epistemic process of pursuing clarity through conceptual categorization, at least for some of our life. This is not the same thing as surrendering conceptual categorization. It is a particular way of using or experiencing concepts. Conceptual categorization is not absent, but this word I keep using, unsatisfactory. This is an aesthetic experience of uncanniness. In such an experience, recall, conceptual categorizations are deployed, the world feels familiar, but nonetheless feel as though they fail to offer this thing called certainty or clarity. And thus the world feels unfamiliar, not yet quite itself. So what rituals of ego work are after, like Heidegger's existential phenomenology and Cabell's ordinary language philosophy, is the uncanniness of the ordinary, of everyday reality. An experience of reality as near, as intimately entangled with oneself, precisely because it does not quite make sense, does not quite have solid purpose, or organization, or form. All of these concepts have been like the obsession of the European philosophical tradition. Call this a phenomenology for the Black Witch, not of. That's me cribbing from Emily Lee, who's written a book that has a similar construction. This isn't a phenomenology of the Black Witch, it's one for this way of inhabiting the world. It is what Miriam Charles is after with Cette Maison. This is a ritual to bring Tessa near, in her life, in the uncanny blur of radical particularity and submergence within the infinite, of presence and absence that is life in death or living death. Perhaps this is what we and the Afro-pessimists forget social death implies. Perhaps this is the second sight, the occult vision with which Du Bois sees through the Negro's eyes. As Patrick Henry puts it, ego work does not seek to clarify the unclarifiable. The work is upon us, upon our sensoria, our hunger for clarity. We are worked upon by ourselves so that we may abandon the false hope of clarity and recognize or acknowledge the intimacy of a present and mysterious world. Black horror film is a ritual inhabitation of an anti-Black world in order to grasp its, Fred Moten's words now, terrible beauty. The terrible beauty of intimacy, of being in, being there, being right here. This is a kind of radical inhabitation of what Afro-pessimism knows as social death, of what both Fanon and Heidegger decry and condemn as homelessness. They dream of the settler's fortress, where life is committed to a ceaseless, exhausting war with unintelligibility. Beyond its gates lie what Fanon calls at war with himself, an arid zone of non-being. The quote continues, in most cases, importantly, the Black man is unable to take advantage of this descent into veritable hell. In most cases. While he dreams of the land above, the Black Witch is busy, head bent, caught up in strange rituals, lost in an uncanny world. I'm going to close this off just because I don't think I should have the last word. I think Charles should.
L'histoire va s'écrire sans nous, encore une fois. Les valises seront défaites. Plus besoin de partir, de passer la frontière à mes côtés. Après-demain, je rentrerai chez moi avec ma fille, mon enfant à venir. On chante, on danse. Le refus d'être étranger sur les générations à venir. Cette joie est immense. Cet espoir est infini. Pourtant, tout est vain et éphémère. Réjouissez-vous. Aujourd'hui et demain encore, j'ai vu cet autre monde. Rien n'a changé.
Je sais. Je sais, mamie. Que tu attends paisiblement. Le cœur lourd. Tu attends. Tu attends. Et tu pries pour le jour de ta mort. Dans l'espoir qu'on se retrouvera. Le jour se lève. Tu attends. La nuit est venue. Tu attends toujours la mort. Et moi, je marche Je veille. Et je me dis que tout est possible ici. Y a personne pour nous servir? Je suis déçue.
C'est des tantes qui ont tout préparé. Elles ne sont pas là pour faire le service.
Ah, je vais goûter à tous les plats. C'est quoi ça?
Des acras. Et ça? Du lait.
Ça a l'air délicieux. Et ça aussi? Ça aussi? Oh, ça aussi? Ça aussi? Oh, ça aussi? Et ça?
Fais attention quand même pour ne pas avoir mal au ventre.
Impossible. Bon, on commence?
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. We have microphones for questions, and I think Danielle might be willing to use them if we need them. Oh, perfect. Okay, cool. Okay, great.
I'm a little bit, if not profoundly confused. I have a question and then a comment to share with the audience. Why did you pick this film? It does not seem to be a horror film. A horror film scares you. This doesn't scare you. It's certainly not a documentary. It seems more like a very sad drama with existentialist overtones. Let me ask that question first, and then I'll make my comment. What I've actually observed about horror films when I was growing up in Manhattan, New York City.
So, my dissertation advisor, Noel Carroll, has this very canonical definition of horror films, right? Horror films give us this feeling, fear, specifically horror, which is an admixture of two feelings, fear and disgust. He says we need these things called monsters to produce this. We need these entities that are both threatening, but also have something like ontological liminality that produces this sense of aversion towards something that is breaking some sort of natural law or norm, right? So this film has the genuine threat of death, right? And then instead of simply producing that threat as something intelligible, the threat itself is turned into something ontologically liminal. So you're absolutely right. It is a documentary with existentialist undertones. My general sort of take is I think that one way to read existentialist theory is precisely as suggesting the proper philosophical mood is a mood of horror, right? Because
I would say it's a mood of sadness. That's what I've observed today.
Yeah. So I would reckon about a middle into the film, there's the actual sequence where her family is brought face to face with Tessa's corpse in the examining office. It is one of the most genuinely unsettling sequences I've watched in film, and it's not unsettling in the sense of like I've watched a lot of sad movies. I've watched films in which I've had to watch this Gaspar Noé film where 2 months after my grandfather died, I had to watch a man slowly die of a heart attack in a single take while the camera just watched it. And I felt so sad. And that's not what I feel there. What I feel is this genuine sense of horror at existence. Not sadness at existence, but aversion and repulsion, which is what sort of Carroll thinks is really,
I got that. All right, thank you. Now, to share with you, I'd love to hear your response to this. I grew up in Manhattan, 86th Street, Riverside Drive, and my best friend, who lived in my apartment, and I, every Sunday, would go see a double feature, and invariably it would be a horror films, and we wanted to be scared. I don't ever remember blacks in those horror films. The years were, let's say, 1955 to 1960. I don't remember any blacks appearing in those films, and I don't remember any black horror films playing in the late 1950s.
And that's
What's your comment on
so
that?
that's exactly the period when race in general and blackness in particular was sort of suppressed in the horror industry. So basically what happens is that from the 30s to the 40s, we get horror really concerned with these supernatural monsters that purportedly exist in the world, in this planet Earth. And invariably the best way to represent that is racial others, right? In the same way that 500 years ago, the way in which, say, the people who lived in Africa or in the Orient were represented is as monsters. Here there be monsters, things we don't quite understand yet, right? What happens in the 50s is Cold War paranoia gets translated specifically with this fear of the alien, right? Because that becomes the weird sort of communist fear, right? It's not like there are these like natural others existing in the world somewhere that we need to watch out for. It's more like there is a social community somewhere that is so radically organized so radically differently than ours, right? And only one of these two sort of social organizations will survive the social Darwinism of, the way in which social organizations develop. And so what has to happen then in the 50s is that horror has to show us these like white American families profoundly threatened by things that are completely unintelligible, not just sort of uncannily unintelligible within like the normative space of like the natural world. And so that's why aliens become the primary way. That said, there are still these
aliens. There was The Fly. There was Godzilla.
Yeah, I was going to say, and the other ones are these interesting scientific crises.
Blacks in the film. Why weren't there any blacks in the film?
So I think it's because the primary concern, right, is this Cold War, like, we could be infected by a social organization that is profoundly anti-American. That's never the concern with racial others, right? Now it is in an interesting way, but historically, definitely in the 30s and 40s, the concern is really like, they're going to destroy this country we've got, not take it over, right? And that's why in Birth of the Nation, you see, Black Reconstruction described as like failed government, not bad, immoral government, right? And in the 50s, the fear really has to be, no, these are really sharp, sophisticated alien life forms, because no other creature on this planet Earth could be as sophisticated as we, Euro-America, are, right? And so the Negro, the Oriental, just doesn't fit within that sort of existential crisis, if that makes sense. That's my take.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Danielle and then Justin. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Kira, for the microphone, and thank you, Nicholas, for that really interesting and wide-reaching conversation. The question about the lack of Black actors in some of these roles reminds me a lot as somebody. I'm currently working on a project that talks about horror and comedy, and I'm a huge fan of The Twilight Zone, so I am thinking immediately about somebody like Rod Serling, who really wanted to infuse the Twilight Zone with Black figures and was not able to do that because of the resistance of American audiences. And so he did exactly the thing, Nicholas, that you are describing, which is to create these sort of unintelligible others who clearly represented racialized figures, right? Especially within the context of what Serling did that I think was so impressive is this idea of merging race with Cold War fears of the time in the late 50s and early 60s. So that's what some of this conversation reminds me of. But I don't want to do the thing of like, this is more of a comment than a question. So I really do have a question, which is I'm wondering if there are any even more recent than what you've seen now, since you're somebody who's so deeply engaged with horror, that you think are there some films that you could direct us to that you think do a really precise job of sort of getting at that level of fear and disgust that you were describing? I'm wondering if something like Sinners perhaps does some of that, but I'd love to just hear some more from you
Sinners,
about this.
so basically I think what happens when the horror genre always goes through these cycles, right? So like the 50s is like really sort of in many ways equivalent to like our 2000s, if you were, like this sort of like after a period of relatively fallow, right, genre production in the 90s, and in this case in the late 40s, there's this like low budget burst, right? And I think right now we're sort of in something like the late 80s. We're at the very slick blockbuster tentpole, right, period of this cycle. And my words of choice aren't as diplomatic as they could be. I think that usually what happens then is what happens with any movie that's made for a mass market audience, and again, this is just sort of no carol, is it has to be intelligible. That's sort of the definition of mass market, right? Is that this can't be the type of artwork that someone leaves going, what was that? Because that raises the question, was that worth my time? Which, when mass art is such a commodity and is so built in this capital sort of like, you know, my free time is where I go to flee my labor, and so it better make me feel good, right? I think that's what happens. And so I think Sinners is a fantastic movie that really shies away from the uncanny, right? I think it's actually become quite rare for a lot of black horror films, I think, to become very interested in the uncanny. I think for reasons that have something to do with like the neoliberalization of our race politics, right? So I think we're a lot more interested in horror films that have very clear moral rights and wrongs, very clear victims and victimized, right? So because I'm a fan of the schlock, Octavia Spencer is in one horror movie that is incredible. It's called Ma. It is incredibly exploitative, just like all of the 1970s blaxploitation movies, which have a kind of aesthetic politics that I think you don't get when things get cleaned up, right? So I would say things like Ma. I would say Atlantics is this fantastic Senegalese French co-production by Mati Diop that's really in this space. And then
Can you say that name again?
Oh yeah, sure. So Atlantics, and then
Atlantic,
the French,
just like the Atlantic Ocean.
exactly, but with a plural. And Mati Diop is the director. But then the other chapters in the other three chapters in the book are Night of the Living Dead, which is I think the perfect example of this for me. Like Romero, in every interview he says I wanted the crisis of America in 1968 to be a completely uncanny crisis, right? I wanted the zombies to have no explanation. I wanted them to just be, the world has changed now, right? So there's that. Then I do a weird favorite of mine, the 1932 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There's been over 100 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde film productions. This is one of the only ones where he explicitly turns into a Negro ape. It is a film made exactly during when King Kong's being produced. Island of Lost Souls, this Negro ape image is like really familiar. 5 years before, 5 years later, it's completely, in fact, drawing from anti-Semitic imagery more than anything, right? But in this period, which not for nothing, is the year of the second International Eugenics Conference, they decide to go with this evolutionary, this Darwinian devolutionary sort of depiction of Hyde, right? So that one, and then the last one is Ganja and Hess, Bill Gunn's masterpiece, which I will say very little about because the film is writing that chapter has been the greatest existential crisis of my career. I love this movie far too much to write about it, but it's really something.
Thank you. Justin.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I think it was really, really generative. I have maybe two questions, two small. I'll try to keep them small questions. I was really curious about the shift to sort of ego work as a way of, I don't want to say clarifying, right? Maybe producing an aesthetic analog for what the phenomenology for the Black Witch might be like. But I guess I've wondered whether or not ego work was itself a bit too legible, right? Thinking about the ego and the degree to which that may belong to the category of a self, which may belong to the category of the human. So I guess I'm wondering, whom might the phenomenology really be for? Because it would seem, I guess as I was thinking about it, I was wondering, would the Negro Witch have an attachment to something called an ego in order to engage in a kind of ego work that would, again, produce this aesthetic experience or this aesthetic phenomenology? and I could see it being more appealing to those of us who might be a little bit more attached to the presence of an ego. But of course, when I think about that in racialized terms, right? Those who believe themselves to be white, so on and so forth. So that's maybe like the first point, is sort of thinking about whether or not ego work is itself a bit too legible because of its sort of reliance on the ego. And then the second thing is I'm loving this bit about horror, and it's got me thinking about the relationship, if there is one, between horror and like the post-apocalyptic. So right now, I'm reading a book called A Sky Full of Elephants, where the premise is like the book. I won't give too many spoilers, but the book starts on a day where sort of like black folks are trying to put their sense of life, I guess, back together after on one strange day, all white people in the world hear a sound and they immediately walk into the ocean, like a mass suicide. But what you see in the wake of that, right? You would think that, okay, no more white people, like anti-black world, social order is gone. Maybe we have, freedom to figure out what we're going to do. But what you find is people just as confused, if not more confused, without the presence of whiteness, right? And I guess I'm thinking about that as a kind of horror, but I don't know if people maybe like would put that in the post-apocalyptic genre, and so it got me thinking about whether there's a relationship between the two. So ego work, is that too clear? And then the relationship between the post-apocalyptic and horror.
Those are great. Yeah, I mean, so just on the first, like, you've given me the kick in the pants that I've wanted, right? Like, reading, I mean, I love Patrick Henry, of course, but, like, he is, like, he's of a generation of black philosophy that's committed to certain priors that I think, like, in the past 15 years, we've seen people start to shake up, right? And I do think he's committed to certain sort of, I mean, like, the book is, like, really at every step of the way, it's very clear what of analytic philosophy he really is still committed to, right? And I do think that this is a very clear case of that. The reason, and so, like, yeah, I'm sort of sold, right? Like, that's sort of really is sort of all I needed. Here's where the hesitation was coming from, and then now I want to figure out what to do to sort of keep the thing I want kept, right? So, like, I think about someone like Saadia Hartman writing on, like, Phyllis Wheatley, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? And I think about, like, Kevin Quashai, right? And, like, Black Aloneness, right? And I think about, like, well, there's this rush in a lot of sort of mystical accounts of Black experience, or just of human experience in general, right? To really flee to these hyperbolic, sort of anti-subjective languages, right? And so, like, I just taught Alice Coltrane last week, and, like, really good example of this, right? Like, when she's in it, right, she says, like, I'm on absolute consciousness, I am part of the infinite universe, and yet she can't stop using the word I.
Yeah.
Right? Like, she very clearly can't articulate the experience she wants without what I want to call, like, a sort of real ambivalence. Right? So I think that's maybe the thing I wanted to retain is, like, maybe it's just a historical contingency that, like, we really have a hard time letting go of this sense of self, but it does feel like it's baked in, right? And so I'm more hopeful in the possibility to render it unstable and unsatisfactory than inaccessible as, like, a thought. But I think ego is too far, and so I'm gonna figure out where that difference can be split. Okay, and then the other fantastic, so as it made clear, I have a quite broad account of horror, and that's in part because I moved from, like, what Carol calls an emotion-centered definition to what I call a mood-centered definition, right? So, like, I just use, like, the Heideggerian account of mood, but, like, most neuroscience has, like, the same basic concept, right? We have these affective states that are, like, responses to environmentality or to the space we're in and its characters rather than the characters of particular objects within it. That space isn't an object that we can sort of have that type of intentional relationship to, right? Our relationship has to be different, right? And I just think that this whole thing about not feeling at home has to, of course, be that, right? And I think there's a lot of genres, and the way I say it these days is, like, there's a lot of uncanny genres. Not all of them have to be what, like, Carol wants to call horror. I would want to call anyone where there genuinely becomes this sense that, like, a person, an action, whatever, becomes monstrous, then we're talking horror. And I think a lot of post-apocalyptic movies head in that direction. But, like, conceivably, they wouldn't need to. I think they'd still definitely be uncanny, right? Like I think a lot of Octavia Butler is in that space of like not actually horror post-apocalypse, really sort of uncanny. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that. Anyways, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah, and
Tim.
Oh, yeah.
Tim, and then Neelan.
I'm so loud, I don't think I need it. That was just fantastic. And as you were talking, I was thinking about an interview with an Irish language writer I read some years ago in Poets and Writers. And she talked about her mother, and she said she was distinguishing her literary approach from the English literary approach, right? So, and you can see how this acts out. I mean, this is another manifestation of what you're talking about.
Yes.
She said her mother was the kind of person in 1990 Dublin, that if she got a knock on the door late at night, the first thing she would say is, "Are you among the living or among the dead?"
Yeah.
So we have, to me, this was a very beautiful manifestation of, partly I think it's been put on Celtic people because they are the others, because they've been colonized from us. But I think the modern world, particularly since the Enlightenment, has been struggling with a massive epistemological crisis. And I think when you were talking about this, I thought this is exactly what occupies my thoughts most of the time. Now, I'm a storyteller, and I've been a storyteller for a long time, and I have a big repertoire. So this whole aspect of narrative, which is, obviously it does not encompass all narrative. There's plenty of narrative that's angular and linear and all the rest of it. But that, like, Are You Among the Dead, that kind of approach to folktales, to legends, to myths, and everything, is a counter-epistemology that tends to be very much, I mean, it's almost like, it's often dismissed, but most of the time it's just allowed as a side issue.
Yeah.
So, in other words, important epistemological things come through science and, pro forma logic and all the rest of it. So I think part of what's going on here, and I just want to hear your reaction to this, you probably know Michael Ventura's essay here, that Black Snake Moan?
No.
You're going to love it, right? You're going to love it. Ventura makes this point that what is called voodoo has actually surfaced in American culture as a corrective, mostly unconscious, and that its primary manifestation has been in American popular music.
Yeah, okay.
Now, anybody who starts tracing will see these lines coming from Europe and coming especially from West Africa. And he emphasizes that this is an epistemology of worship, which has been just pushed aside. I remember the first time I read about Loas, and I thought, well, that's not going to play in white America, because that seems to fit perfectly, right, with the idea of primitive, all this whole thing. And yet, he said, people can't get enough of rock and roll. So this whole thing was, and I mean, when you think of it, our Achilles heel, so to speak, adolescents, who were experiencing this much more directly than they're, So I have a term that I've felt myself forced to coin, which is, I wondered, what do you say about all of these forms of narrative in this moment? Fairy tales, myths, I mean, it goes to legends, which are partly historically based. Surrealism is part of it, magic realism part of it. So I call it transrealism, and it seems to me that what you're talking about is the gigantic inflow of transrealism in epistemology about Black experience down through the centuries, particularly in anti-racist terms. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes complete sense. Yeah, I mean, there's this great Horton Spiller's essay on Black sermons, right? And just like why have we really failed to consider the fact that obviously the vast majority of intellectual production on Black life has happened on the pulpit, right? With a radically different vector of sort of knowledge pursuit than anything happening in like Harvard classrooms, right? And yeah, I mean, this is exactly where I'm at, right? And so like the language I'm using these days, I love this transrealism thing. I like it better than the surrealism because that's just obviously so like historically located and like actual surrealism.
One vein, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm obsessed with the word occult these days, right? I'm obsessed with its like sort of genealogy of meaning. Not side project. You're helping me feel more confident in not identifying it as such, but like what I have been identified to others as a side project for the past couple of years has been the long tradition of like the European occult, right? As a series of counter narratives, as a series of counter epistemologies and metaphysics within the European tradition, right? And so I'm really trying to, it's like a pincer move, right? I'm really trying to figure out like inside and outside, how is this edifice of like the European Enlightenment always already being shaken? Like it's never satisfactory, right? Yeah.
Well, the cultural geography of Europe makes this very clear if you are aware of this. So, I mean, if one is aware of this. So you look at, for example, the way Anglo-Saxon culture has pushed Celtic cultures to these margins. And you find that, as often happens, the main force in any culture tends to want to propagate itself and to minimize the other things. But then it suddenly finds that it is in a symbiotic relationship with those other things. And we have all kinds of usually unofficial, under the table, smuggled cultural, back and forth, where there is a beautiful balance to be achieved there. And yet, obviously, it's. I mean, look at the English in 800 years.
Exactly.
My thought is, and this is my final thing, I feel like there actually is something stirring toward. This is a big claim, right? Toward a paradigm shift in this way. And I think one of the things we see now is what's happening on the frontiers of science, especially since quantum mechanics.
Yes,
a lot of those old things are breaking down, and they're breaking down in ways that people can now go, what the fuck is a black hole? What's in it? That kind of thing. I think we might be doing that, and that's one of the reasons I find that your work is just so important, because it's the big pushes that are going to make that snowball start rolling down.
That's literally. I mean, right? I'm right with you. I mean, like just the final two thoughts are just first, I do think that the quanta stuff is not that I threw out was not just thrown out, right? Like I really do we make this stuff work by realizing that empiricism is with us, right? By really saying okay, no, a real empirical science, which of course most of Enlightenment science has not been, is reaching here, right? It's Humean, right? And Hume is a lot more on this side of the ballpark, right? But also, just as a final thought, I don't know if I ever told you this, my sister in the crowd. I don't know if I ever told you this, Juliet, but as a kid, one of my primary fantasies and my primary existential sort of sense of vectors or sense of direction was, so no one's been inside a black hole, you say. I gotta see it. Right? I was this child being told that there are these things that, guess what? Yeah, science got us here, but that's not the thing that got you God, but we know even less about this than we know about God. And of course a kid who also was raised Catholic and was raised with this relationship, right, with something what Gary Tomlinson calls the invisible of any culture, right? I'm well, that's my invisible, right? And I do think that there are more and more generations of folks who have grown up under scientific regimes that are pursuing the invisible too.
But that's a perfect example too, because we're talking about something that is supposedly scientific, but if that's not a spiritual question, I don't know
what it is.
Let's do at least one more question.
I'm in no rush, so I'm happy to sit as long as we do questions.
As long as you have,
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Justin said that was really generative. And of course, I want to ask you about music.
Yes,
and you opened with it, but I'm going to save it. So, because I really want to hear you talk more about witchcraft.
Yes, please.
And there were a couple moments in your talk, there were many, but two where I was really just brought to a standstill. One was ritual inhabitations of black atmospheres at the edge of comprehension as the definition of black witchcraft. And the other one was that, the unclear and uncanny conceptual categorization that should feel like that in the black world, but doesn't. So I wanted to ask you more about how you're imagining this ritual inhabitation and whether those rituals, do they show or without making intelligible the role of uncanniness in the production of race and help us move from what we should be seeing inhabiting a black world but don't? Or how are you imagining those rituals, and is there a gendered aspect to that? Because it is the phenomenology of the witch and not the warlock.
Yes.
Phenomenology for the witch.
Yeah. I mean, this is a project of black feminism, absolutely. And the book, by its conclusion, is making that very clear. And I'm trying to do this long game sort of, I'm joining I'm joining the dunk tank line with poor Fanol strapped up in the chair, and I'm saying this guy just has these priors that are just this commitment, right, to this kind of European patriarchy that he just cannot see beyond, right? And Fred Moten reads him in this way, but he does, because he can't not. And so he's at war with himself, right? He's really, and by the time you get to Wretched of the Earth, and you have him on the one hand so dismissive, right, of the lumpen proletariat, right, of anyone who is not, right, like a proper vanguard, right, political actor, and then he has these crazy 10-page descriptions of, like, the value of psychosomatic disorders, like, pre-mortem rigor mortis in, like, Senegalese workers, and he's like, yeah, that's revolution too, but, like, yeah, that's spooky kind of revolution. That's, like, mental illness as revolution, and, like, I'm not gonna stand as much behind that as I will behind the prettier stuff, right? And so I think that, like, I really want to think about, like, how this sort of, these patriarchal commitments are really bound up with this sense-making enterprise, right, within, like, theory as this project of, bushwhacking into the world and making it all make sense and putting everything in its proper box because, someone has to take this, domestic space where people live and turn it into, like, a productive and economic space, right? And so I really think that, the witch, for me, is all bound up with the witch's home, right, with this image of this matriarchal space, right, this space where the structure of organization is fundamentally different in kind than any other structure of organization, right? And yeah, that's what rituals are for me, right? So there's these moments in the film, right, where the mother character will sort of at one point the daughter character picks up one of the many tchotchkes that the mother has on her desk, and if Caribbean families, like there are tchotchkes like that just accumulate in this like sacred way that has absolutely no intentionality. I mean, as a kid, I was doing this, and I didn't even realize it's because my grandmother, when I would go to visit her New York apartment, she'd have them all over too, right?
That's a Yiddish word,
Yeah, tchotchke, yeah. But I don't know if we have a good sort of Caribbean word for it, but I would like to have one. But that's what, I mean, they're such tchotchkes, right? And she freaks out when the daughter picks them up, and she rushes over and she puts them back, right? And the daughter's like, do not pretend there is order here, right? And of course there's not order here. The mother is sort of like, that's never, I'm sort of filling in the dialogue, of course, but that's never what was at stake here. That piece belongs right there. I'm not making a claim about like the general, right, is the way it sort of moves for her. Like I'm saying like, you've just moved that thing from its place, right? And so I think of these rituals as like exercises of heightened attention, right, to the materiality of one's surroundings, right? In Vodun rituals and in many like spiritual rituals, it's that sort of heightened attention, whether through music, incense, whatever. That's this way in which the material begins to feel infected with something like the immaterial. For what it's worth, Rudolf Otto describes that as unheimlich, uncanny, quite literally, like that's the exact word he uses, right? And so I really want to think about rituals as this way of structuring engagement with like the real texture of one's materiality, where that somehow is doing a lot of work, but I'm filling in that gap, right? That attention is what's necessary to get to this sense of, oh, but there's something bigger. There's something occulted behind what I'm looking at right now. I couldn't move anything out of the way to find it, right? Does that make any sense? Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you. We have much to talk about.
I know, we have so much to talk about. So it's 5 o'clock, so what I propose is that we say some thank yous that we need to say, and then if you are able to stay longer and want to ask a couple more questions, it sounds like
I'm there. I'm having a blast. I'm happy to sit here.
So just like as a round of thank yous, I really want to thank the Center for Arts and Humanities first and foremost. Thank you. Thanks especially to you, Danielle, and you, Britt. Thank you so much for Danielle Morgan for your help. And also to OML and where's Shelley? Shelley's right there. Thank you, Shelley. Also, this event was co-sponsored by COM and Ethnic Studies. And I'm missing one. Oh, and philosophy. And also also, if you would like to watch the film Cette Maison, the library has gained access to streaming it for the next year. So if you use the library streaming, you can watch the whole film.
How do you do that?
If you go to the library website and you search the film title Cette Maison, it should show up in the catalog, or you can ask the librarian if you have any trouble locating it that way. But they do have access.
You can watch it at home.
Yeah, on your computer. Yeah, exactly.
Is it Canopy?
Maybe.
Probably Canopy.
Or exactly. Yeah, exactly.
You have to have a library card.
Yeah. There you go.
City or SCU, whatever.
Okay, cool. So do we have any other questions? But also, if you have to go, it is fine.
No pressure.
Appreciate that.
I'm really happy to chat more.
Can I ask a question about the actual form of the film?
Yeah.
The use of 16 millimeter,
Yes.
as opposed to 35 millimeter or another film. So, why is this? One, do you talk about this in your book, and does it support the idea of illegibility? And also, does the distress that happens on the surface of the film add to the narrative or the interruptive aspect of your narrative?
Yes. That's great. Yeah, I mean, right, so I have this line at the beginning, like, a black skin scarred by flecks of light, right? Like, I really had this, I didn't even actually thematize that in the way you just said, so thank you for doing that, because I just had this immediate, I think, sensory sense of, like, whoa, yeah, like, this is a ravaged thing, right? But I think the other thing that 16 millimeter does, and, like, yeah, 35 does it too, 70 as well, but 35 might, but it's really 16, right? It has that, like, that real materiality, right? And I think it comes from, like, a friend of mine works on this, and he's like, he thinks it's the quality of the light, right? The way in which the light falls, like, on the objects. There's just this real sense of space between objects in something like 16 millimeter. Shadows are more heightened, and so there's really this sense of, like, there's something there that I can chew. Like, compare that to a Marvel movie, right? Like, the most flat surface you can possibly look at, right? And so I really think that, like, she's only used 16 millimeter throughout all of her short films, so it's very much like a very intentional choice. And all of these films are like, this is the first film in which there's something besides landscape shots, right? So I think it's really this sense of embeddedness in a place, in an environment. But that embeddedness is, like, it's not total, right? There's these scars, there's this sense of, like, distress, and this sense of which the thing, the materiality is of the actual celluloid, the medium by which the thing. So, like, there's all sorts of cool phenomenological layers. Yeah.
But it also pushes it into the past, and the
Yes.
color palette of a 16 millimeter versus more contemporary filmic form.
That's right.
And
it just. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Well, I'm teaching Bontoc Eulogy next week, which is this fantastic Filipino-American documentary from the 70s. That's, like, one of the really early, incredibly Bontoc Eulogy, BONTOC, Eulogy. It's, like, one of an incredibly political movie that's a filmmaker trying to find the body of his grandfather, who was taken from a small island in the Philippines and trotted around the American World's Fairs. The hypothesis is he's in some, Harvard, he's pickled in some Harvard lab or something, right? It's like crazy. And so the whole film is, like, looking for this, missing person. And there's these horrifying shots of, like, Bontoc tribes people during the World's Fair, like, being recorded on early phonograms, while there's also early silent footage recording them. And, like, you're reminded of the person holding the camera and the power they have, and, like, oh, Kara Keeling is who I've gotten this point about the convergence of race in the development of film. And so what she would sort of say is, like, yeah, film was first developed for ethnography, right? To look at people, to look at weird kinds of people. And I think there's something really important about, like, that sort of, memory that that kind of footage evokes. Yeah.
That's really fascinating.
May I ask a quick follow-up?
Yes.
So, for what it's worth, I'm situated largely in analytic film mind and environmental
Cool, great.
Contextualized in that way. But
I want to follow up on Maylin's question, actually. So I'm curious about how, when we characterize witchcraft broadly, and we think about the rituals implicit in witchcraft, we often frame it in terms of casting spells or utilizing certain artifacts in order to evoke representational contents that, as you put it, are intentional. And so I'm curious about this tension between representational or intentional phenomenology, experiences that are conceptually imbued by their nature, right? Because representational content is propositionally structured, which means, of course, you know this, it's compiled of concepts arranged in a particular kind of way. And so with that in mind, how are we